Hello, and welcome to the 14th episode of Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. In this episode, we will discuss Payoff. So the text describes Payoff as follows. After a score, the PCs take stock of their income from the operation. A successful score generates both rep and coin. This can be role-played if it is interesting to do so, otherwise it can be simply dealt with mechanically. So if the PCs are receiving the job that they have just done, the score they've just done, from a interesting character with a complex relationship to them, then you may want to role play out that scene. If you want to see a very good example of how this can be done, check out John Harper's Roleplay Blades series on the Roleplay YouTube channel. You can see that after each score, he roleplays out the scene between the player characters and their employer. This is an example of free play, even though it is before the end of the downtime phase. So if you look at the start of the book, it says that free play usually happens between the downtime phase and the score phase. However, it is a little bit open when free play might happen, and this optional role playing during Payoff is an example of where you might want to insert some free play in between parts of the downtime phase. This is really something that you have to get used to as a GM of Blades in the Dark, moving beyond simply following a very rigorous schedule of phases and inserting little alternate phases or sub-phases in between the main phases of play. Another example of this is doing a setup operation during a score, or even during free play. So the more you get used to the game, the more you can kind of dynamically adjust the phases of play and weave them together into overall narrative experience. So next we move on to reputation, or rep as it's abbreviated in the text. So you earn 2 rep by default for a score, and you add 1 rep for every tier the target is above the crew. So if they are 1 tier above the crew, then they would get 3 rep by default. You subtract 1 rep for every tier the target is below the crew, to a minimum of 0. So you can never lose rep for doing a job against small fry, but they're also not going to advance your crew. A completely quiet operation generates 0 rep no matter what. So this makes sense in terms of the sort of simulationist end of this game. However, it also exists for a reason. It provides another incentive for the players to take on risky jobs against big targets. So they're going to get more rep for doing those jobs, and they're also going to get rep if they do them a little bit loudly, right? If they leave some mark of the operation, and that's going to encourage them to take risks that might leave some trace that they had actually been there. So if you were playing with a group of bravos, this is unlikely to ever be an issue, but if you're playing with one of the quieter or sort of more stealthy crews, then you may want to remember this rule just to encourage the players to take risks here and there. And this is similar to how there is an engagement roll bonus for a bold and daring plan. Again, it's just pushing the crew to be aggressive. Alright, so next we move on to coin. This is determined by the nature of the operation and the loot seized on the job. So there is a payoff scale, which follows the nature of the operation, and then you may give some sort of bonus loot that is available on the job, which could further increase the amount of coin earned from the job. So, for example, I was recently running Karma in the Dark, and I included a set of sort of antique or premium guns in the target's room. And the players had the option to take those for a little bit more risk, and then that gained them an extra bit of coin when they finished the job. So to take a look at the payoff scale, you get 2 coin for a minor job. This is equivalent to several full purses. 4 coin, it's a small job or strong box. So 4 coin is the maximum that the crew can actually have in its stash, or in its holdings by default before you get vaults, right? So you can imagine that your crew has some kind of strong box that they use to hold this extra money that isn't on the person of any one of the characters and also isn't in the stash. And 6 coin, this is for a standard score. It's decent loot. 8 coin, a big score, serious loot. So that's double the amount that you could possibly hold in your crew's holdings by default. And 10 plus coin, a major score, impressive loot. So you remember, if you look at the stash rankings on the player sheet, 10 coin is equivalent to a full row on there. So that is quite an impressive amount of loot from just one job. So the coin can be put on the crew sheet, including vaults. So those 4 coins by default, and then above that you need to have vaults in order to have it in there. Or it can be divided among the crew members, and if the crew members divide it among themselves, then they can optionally put that coin into their stashes. Because remember, the crew does not have a stash. Each of the characters have a stash for their own individual retirement. Alright, so next we move on to paying tithes. So there may be a crime boss in your district who expects your smaller crew to pay a tithe to them. The tithe is equal to your crew tier plus 1. So if you start out at tier 0, then you have to pay only 1 coin for this. But the higher your tier goes up, the more the crime boss is going to start taking in tithes. This creates antagonism between the crew and a local higher tier faction, and it gives the players an incentive to try to overthrow them. So just like the previous rules we discussed, push the crew to be aggressive on jobs, this encourages antagonism in the faction game. So we're actually going to see another feature of the faction game, or the sort of faction system of Blades in the Dark, when we continue on to our next video, which will be about heat. But first, let's discuss guaranteed payment. The GM must grant the coin and rep the crew is due after a score. So this is not an option. As a GM, you have to pay out the amount they are due. So this is unlike in games like Shadowrun, where your Mr. Johnson can screw over the team and they can end up in a situation where they don't get paid. Another similar game that has this feature is the Sprawl, right? So very common in cyberpunk games. But the thing is that heat, harm, consequences, stress, and trauma already represent the fallout of the job. You don't need to pile on an extra problem, an extra complication of the crew not getting paid what they're due, because there's already all these systems to represent the fallout of the job. You don't need to just like pile it all on that one thing. It's already there on the character sheets. There's no need to double up by making the score worthless. So as I said, in our next episode, we will be discussing heat, and I will see you then.